Good day, everybody. And today, as our very special guests on Smoke on Go, we have Clemmy and James. And they head up the aviation insurance division of Santam Insurance. Very experienced in the field of aviation insurance, the two of them. So what sort of aeroplanes in general are you insuring?
So we've got about 400 odd brokers on our books that we deal with.
How many brokers?
About 400 odd.
400 brokers.
And I'd say of those, maybe 6 or 7 are actually specialist aviation brokers. And by that, I mean that's their main line of business. And the rest would be generalist brokers, maybe that deal with Santam or not, that have a client then who owns an aircraft as well. In terms of what aircraft we insure, we start with right down at the microlight end, and then we can't write, strictly speaking, aircraft more than 60 seats.
Right, so you say that there are about 6 brokers that specialize in this. They will ask you for quotes. You need to actually look at the value of the aeroplanes. You need to look at their age. You need to look what they're being used for. So we call this a risk assessment, do we not?
Yeah.
And who would handle the risk assessment?
Well, the both of us. So we receive the instruction or the request from the broker, and we'll go through everything, all the details, whatever we still require, we'll go back and ask. And from there, both James and myself, we'll do a quote for the client, for the broker.
So what sort of things do you look at there?
I guess years has taught us that in a particular situation, a 40-year-old will react differently to a 20-year-old and so on as you move up the age categories. That would be specific to certain classes of business. But other than that, it's what Clementia says. A particular pilot, what his experience is, what his experience on that type of aircraft is, maybe that specific aircraft, maybe if it's a retractable aircraft, how much retractable experience he's got, or tailwheel experience. They're all things you have to take into consideration, which means you actually need to know your aircraft quite well as well.
From many of the policies that I have read, I've seen that you place a certain emphasis on the geographical aspects of the insurance. What is your take on insuring aeroplanes that are going to be flying over Lesotho or into Botswana or into Mozambique, for example? Maybe also Namibia and Zimbabwe, I don't know. But what is your take?
Well, we usually increase our excesses. So for Mozambique, we've got an increased excess.
There's certain areas in Mozambique which, from a security perspective, are high risk now. Getting things repaired in a country like Mozambique is difficult, so you have to bring them back here. And often the cost of retrieval and the delays in getting things out, it takes time and it costs money. So that's why you have the loaded excess. Other areas like our bordering countries, Namibia is not an issue. Zimbabwe is not an issue. Places like Zambia. In Tanzania, Kenya, we also find it's relatively easy to fix things and get things recovered. But as you start going up north where you have less sort of sustainable infrastructure and repair facilities available, then it becomes difficult. It usually means you've got to bring the aircraft back. It may have crashed in a really remote part of
Tanzania
or Congo or wherever.
Yeah.
And the cost of retrieval on a small fixed-wing aircraft can actually make it, they often end up just being written off right there and then, even though they are repairable, because it's economically, it's just not viable.
Yeah.
Another factor with areas, particularly the swamps, Namibia to a large degree, is a lot of the aviation infrastructure has grown up around tourism. They service the camps, which means you usually got high net worth individuals flying around from the viewpoint that they're usually foreign, which means often litigation, if there is any, can take place in the country of origin, which a lot of the time could be a place like the United States, and litigation will cost you there. So they're things you've got to bear in mind in those areas.
When you write a policy for an individual, there are a number of factors. Number one on the list would be the hull insurance. That's what everybody's worried about. There's hull insurance. There's public liability insurance. Heaven forbid you should fly into Ellis Park by mistake.
Yeah.
Okay. There is passenger liability. And there are all sorts of different things that you can either include or that you can exclude. What could you insure against?
The hull war cover as well. So that's like your SASRIA cover in the motor industry. It's hull war, which is against malicious damage and riots and stuff like that.
That's malicious damage and riots. Now, what about vandalism? You leave your aeroplane
Yeah, it would be covered.
outside at the little airfield outside a small town, and the next morning you come back and that aeroplane's been gutted.
Covered under the same section that Clemente has referred to. So a general package would look like you'd have your hull. You'd have your liability, which would usually be framed as a combined single limit, which would be made up of third party and passenger liability. So your third party element for any damage due to third party, and then passenger, obviously, if any passengers that are injured. And then to simplify it, that often gets rolled up into one amount, and it's called a combined single limit.
I remember that, yes.
And then with that, you'll have your war. That would be your main three components to your policy document. And then on top of that, you could, for example, ensure you could take an excess buy down, where you could insure your excess down.
So the excesses differ on different aircraft as well. So your twin engine would be more than 20,000, it's 40,000. Your helicopters also has a different excess. So it's not all just standard 20. So we try and, rate it per aircraft as well.
Yes.
Or per aircraft class.
What is your policy, if any, in respect of aerobatics and crop spraying?
The general rules still apply. You look at the same criteria, experience, aircraft type, all those sort of things. But then you add the added component is this higher risk activity, be it crop spraying or aerobatics. So now you start taking into consideration not just the pilot's experience in total, but how much experience does he have, for example, in an aerobatic field or in a crop spraying field. You look at numbers. There aren't 20,000 crop sprayers. And inherently, they're relatively high-valued aircraft. So now you've got to start charging according to the spread you have as well, besides the risk. And with crop spray in particular, it's been a very difficult area to make money in. And I mean, we've actually got to the point where we started to pull back from crop spraying because you'll find you have a client for 3 or 4 years, but then when he does have the claim, it's so big it wipes out the next 10 years' premium.
Come the dreaded day that somebody has an accident, then the same as we talked about risk assessment, you now have to do an assessment as to why this happened, and you're going to call in an expert, and that would be what you call an assessor. And the assessor starts off usually with the paperwork.
We usually work on a rotational basis to make it fair. We'll give one day will be one assessor, the next claim, and the next one. The first thing they'll do is make contact with the client. They'll establish where the aircraft is. Does it need to be removed from the runway? Do we need to appoint maybe security if it's in a remote area? That sort of thing. From there, we'll send them a copy of the policy, and they'll go through that policy, and they'll check, what the aircraft covers, who the pilots are that are covered under the policy, all the pertinent factors in terms of, what is actually covered under the insurance policy. Then they start with the investigation. A big part of that will be about checking the necessary documentations in place. So that'll include your certificate of airworthiness, your license, your medicals, all that kind of stuff. If it's just LSA aircraft, your authority to fly. If you're doing commercial work, do you have the right license, etc. The next part will be actually investigating the actual accident, trying to establish, what went wrong. Maybe it's straightforward. Maybe you landed on the runway and you hit a buck that was crossing it.
I think we need to mention as well that the assessors aren't in-house Santam assessors.
Yeah.
They're external. They've got companies of their own, and it is a risk within our area because how many are there? 4 or 5 assessors that we have in South Africa. So we do them on a rotational basis.
Yes.
Because they're just so few assessors that we have.
Yes.
It is an actual risk that we have within the industry.
It's an aging profession. The guys are either approaching retirement age or shot past retirement age and are still carrying on.
Yeah.
So we do need some young blood to come into that area.
But as far as the paperwork is concerned, I think a message has to go out to pilots that own and insure aeroplanes that paperwork is actually a vital aspect of this whole operation, because any one of those could actually jeopardize the insurance that you have taken out.
Yeah, it's right. And I mean, there's a growing frustration in the time it takes to get paperwork nowadays. And often that means, pilots just fly.
Yes.
They may have submitted it, but at the end of the day, the onus is on you to make sure you've got it. The number of times we come across people who are doing charter in terms of its definition or commercial work, and they're not actually operating with an air service license because they think they can do it via another means. is quite often. It's actually staggeringly often, and it's going to create a problem come claim time. If you haven't got the right documents in place, your claim's not going to get paid, and it's not something we want to do. You don't comply with the terms and conditions of the policy. And in fact, I always say the worst thing we ever have is a problem claim. It's so much easier to have a claim, you know it's straightforward, you pay the claim, you've got a happy customer.
So that brings me to the final point, and that is, what exactly is breach of the air navigation regulations all about? How do you insure against that?
In terms of the policy, you have to comply with all the air navigation regulations. You have a clause in the policy, which is the breach of air navigation regulation clause, and it's actually there to protect. If you, for example, own an aircraft and I flew it as well, I was a named pilot, and I unknowingly to you went ahead and breached an air regulation, and it resulted in an accident and damage to the aircraft. If you had no knowledge of that, the policy would still indemnify you. That clause is there to protect you. So you wouldn't be responsible for my recklessness or my breach of those regulations. You'd still be paid out as the owner of the aircraft. In terms of enforcing regulations, I mean, at the end of the day, the regulations, they're laid out, they are what they are. And the only time we'll know if someone hasn't complied is if there's an accident and there's either witness or proof that they didn't comply, in which case your policy won't respond. If it's your aircraft and you've knowingly breached the air regulation, you've got no cover.
That is the way I would have thought it would be. Right.
And you know, in years gone by, if you breached a regulation, you'd probably be called in and be forced to rewrite air law or something, or go fly extra many hours with an instructor or get yourself back on track. And I think we should probably go back to that system, because there's definitely a, I don't know if it's an attitude problem creeping in, but I mean, more and more rules and regulations seem to be circumvented nowadays.
Many a guy that is taxied into a fuel drum or
being blinded by the sun.
Or being blinded by the sun.
Or the birds. What about the birds?
Absolutely. Where if they have had a propeller strike and this requires shock loading, they've got to pull that engine apart. And now the engine has to be overhauled in its entirety from a tiny little event. Now you're overhauling the engine, and what comes into play is the issue of betterment. What exactly is betterment?
The principle in aviation, or any insurance policy, you've got to be put back into the same position you were before you had the accident. So in aircraft, components are lifed. A lot of them are lifed. You got maybe a propeller's got a 3,000-hour life cycle, or 50, whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. So if you, at the time of the claim, are halfway into that life cycle, you have to be put back into the same position. So let's say you've got 150 hours left on the prop or the particular part. They'll try and replace it with that particular. Sometimes it's not possible though. Or the client may not wish that. He would rather have a new one. Then you got to work out the difference between what a new one costs, what it would have cost at that particular point, and the insurance company will pay
A portion.
The portion that would have been on the aircraft at the time, in terms of that life, and the balance would then be for the insurance cost. It can be a contentious issue. If you've taken the policy out and it hasn't been explained to you at the outset that there is such a thing as betterment and you don't understand it, it could be a rude awakening for you that you've got to maybe pay a portion of it yourself. So, a good broker would actually explain the concept of betterment to his client before they actually take out the policy. Well, certainly should make him aware of it or her aware of it.
Yes, it can be a very emotive action. I have heard pilots whinging and moaning, all right, but they actually are just not being reasonable. They're not seeing for themselves that it is usually a cut and dried thing, and it's based on the data and the information and the facts, and it is not unreasonable, the issue of betterment.
It's not. You also need to educate your client up front. If you're aware these things, something like betterment exists when you take out a policy, it doesn't come as a shock, and it's easier to get your head around.
And I think that's the difference in aviation. You've got the policy wording, and most people don't read the wordings.
Yeah.
So you rely on your broker.
Yeah, I've read and understood.
Yes,
tick here.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody just signs on the dotted line and that's it. So in aviation, you really need your broker then to explain things like betterment. Because it's in your policy wording, but people don't read these things.
Are you doing a lot of insurance of drones?
Yes, we definitely are. One of the topics that we had earlier was the crop spraying. And
The drones that are being used for crop spraying.
now drones are being used
Yes.
for crop spraying as well. And there, it's cheaper. It's actually cheaper, and there's less human error involved
in the spraying.
in the spraying of the
yes.
drone. So we insure lots of farmers, and they're using these drones. So drones it's an industry that's growing and is going to grow much, much bigger in the future.
The thing is with, if you go to the agricultural sector, for a farmer, now he can go buy his own drone or a fleet of drones, and he's paid it off, it's done. And it's inherently cheap compared to an aircraft. He can educate himself reasonably easily, and most of these things are autonomous. You just pre-program in the coordinates and they'll fly the grids and do the spraying. You can collect quite a lot of data at the same time. I always think that in a way will be groundbreaking having done drone insurance, because drone insurance will eventually spill over into taxi insurance. There'll be people carrying drones. It's used for mining, it's used for surveillance. In terms of power line work and that, they're bringing drones in.
We talked about hull, we talked about war, we talked about passenger liability, combined single limit, that is including the third-party liability. Now you're looking at a drone.
In fact, if you look at any drone policy in the world, you can see it's a generic version of an aviation policy. It's almost to the T the same, but with some changes.
Yeah.
I mean, it is
some things apply and some things don't apply.
And some things have come in that weren't on an aircraft.
The thing that worries me is collision in flight, smacking into one of these things. And indeed, the other day, I was leading the Flying Lions on a flight between Rand Airport and Krugersdorp. And the next thing there, from 4 aeroplanes in formation, there was a drone. And I overtook this drone, and it was just sitting off my left wing. And I thought to myself, it could happen just like that you fly into a drone. Have you taken this into account in any form or in any way?
South African drone legislation is actually very good. I mean, the actual wording. We were quite far ahead of a lot of the rest of the world when it was legislated and put together. Enforcement's another issue. I mean, you can have rules, but they need to be enforced. But I mean, there's definitive rules around what you can and can't do with a drone, where you can operate at proximity to airports, that kind of stuff. So you're going to be liable if you go flying a drone on the outskirts of Rand Airport here and it flies into something. So
who's going to be liable?
The drone operator.
The drone, right.
So your policy will cover third-party damage, but if you're breaking the rules and regulations, the same as in an aviation policy, you're not going to be covered. So if you're going to come here in the car park, set off a drone, I think it's 50 kilometers proximity to the airport that you're not allowed. You're going to be in breach of the regulations and you're going to be accountable. Your policy is not going to respond, and chances are the aircraft owner is going to sue you for...
If you can find out.
But
who it was that had put that thing up into the sky.
Yeah, but drones have serial numbers. You can track it down.
You can,
yeah.
So with the drones as well, we've got the commercial drones, and for those you need a license. And then you've got your private drones, and you don't need a license for that. Those are usually, what you gift your son for Christmas or something, just playing in the backyard. But now your commercial ones, these are the ones used for agriculture, for mining, photography, surveillance. Those guys need a license.
And your commercial drones are less of a problem. Generally, people who go into that field, that's going to be their living. They apply, they get their license from the CIA, the RSC, their pilots are licensed, and they're conducting a commercial operation and they want to operate properly.
Santam actually has an online drone facility now on the website.
Okay.
So you can get your quote online. You don't need to contact the office.
So you can moving with the times.
We're moving with the times, Scully. We're online.
Okay.
So we've got the drones as well as pilot access that we can do online.
Thank you for that information. And with that, I need to tell you that I thoroughly enjoyed the morning with the two of you, and thank you very much. Is there anything you want to ask me?
No, well, I mean, thanks for having us. It's always good to chat to you.
We enjoy the experience that we get from you as well, Scully.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Scully.